And I think my talk really will pick up on some of the issues I think Phil was referring to. I'm not an ethnomethodologist. I wouldn't claim that identity, but the approach that I do take to Milgram's data is, I would say, sympathetic to that line of argument as well, engaging with the details of interaction and what actually goes on within the laboratory of Milgram. So yeah, I'm going to try and use the talk to make a case for revisiting the definition of obedience that we use in social psychology, and try and unhook the idea of obedience and orders, and hopefully the reason for that will become clear as we go along. Let's see if this is going to work. There we go. So hopefully that will be moving on to the next slide there. I do have some audio clips later on as well to use. So when we get to that, we'll see if I've actually ticked the right box in the screen sharing option and being able to share the sound as well. I won't spend too much time going through the ins and outs of Milgram's experiments, because I'm guessing that for this audience that's not particularly necessary. Many people across lots of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences are familiar with at least a broad outline of Milgram's studies. The canonical participant here sat at the shock generator delivering what he believes to be potentially dangerous electric shocks to someone who he believes to be an unsuspecting fellow research participant, and then the white-coated experimenter issuing orders, or so we're led to believe, to participants whenever they express any doubts as to whether they're going to continue. One of the things that I have in common with many people here actually is I became fascinated with Milgram's studies through getting into the archived material from those studies some years ago now. And I was really amazed and surprised to see just how much material was held in the Yale archives there from Milgram's studies. There's not from every experimental condition that he conducted, but from most of the experimental conditions. There's a fair representation of the experimental sessions there, and I've accessed a number of those. I'm just going to be talking about data from 3 of those sessions in the talk today. And a couple that I focused on from a very early point in my my research with the Milgram archives, experiment 2 and 20, so what's known as the voice feedback condition, and what Milgram himself termed the women as subjects condition, the only condition in which women took part. And these I selected really because they offer 2 of the best and most complete representations of what we might call the baseline procedure for Milgram, the one that we'd be familiar with from most descriptions in textbooks, from the film that Milgram himself produced in the mid-60s to give an overview of his experiment. They produced this classic sort of 60-odd% obedience level, 25, 26 out of 40 participants in each condition, going all the way to the end of the shock generator, giving the 450 volt shock. And we have a reasonable number of the sessions represented in the archives there, 39 from condition 2, 31 from condition 20, which again, for people who are familiar with Milgram's book, you might be wondering why the women as subjects condition is number 20. That's the archive system of numbering, rather than the one that Milgram adopted for the book, where it was brought earlier in the narrative to experiment 8. It was actually one of the final conditions that Milgram ran. After many other procedural variations, he finally got round to thinking about varying gender, I guess, but it was the early 1960s. The other condition that I've drawn on for today's talk is what's known as the touch proximity condition. This is experiment 4 that Milgram ran, and this was the one where, in order to deliver the supposed electric shock, the naive participant had to physically hold the learner's hand down onto a shock plate to apparently ensure that the electric shock was administered. And we do get a lower obedience rate there of 30%, just 12 out of the 40 participants went all the way. And we've got not quite as many recordings in the archives there, 25 I was able to identify. And my approach to working with these data when I've got the audio records is to obviously listen through to them a couple of times and start to make transcripts and go back, listen again, tidy things up. So I've produced reasonably detailed transcripts of all the experimental sessions in these conditions. And then I use an approach based on rhetorical psychology. I won't sort of labour the details of this approach. I don't necessarily think it's necessary to understand the ins and outs of this particular approach to hopefully to follow the argument. I would flag up the work of Michael Billig in particular as the originator of this approach. If not familiar with Billig's work, I highly recommend it. Very readable, particularly the 1987 text Arguing and Thinking, very, very influential, stressing the role of rhetoric in social life and really part of a wider, what at the time in the 1980s was called the rhetorical turn, or the turn to language in the social sciences, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and really trying to draw that into social psychology, which as again the discussion just before I started to talk was touching on these ideas of social psychology as having gone down a different path. Well, this was a concerted attempt by a number of scholars in the 80s and into the 90s to try and bring in some of these ideas to the heart of social psychology with some success. But if you look at the contents pages of something like the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, you'll find that that success had its limits. It's not represented in the mainstream of the discipline in North America still to this day. So Billig and others in that approach emphasize the importance of looking at language use, and particularly persuasive rhetorical language. And so it's trying to move away from the idea of reducing people's responses to questionnaire or experimental responses, those sorts of things. And it is part of a wider movement in the field of social psychology to try and develop approaches informed by one form or another of discourse analysis. But I think that's all I probably need to say about that at the moment. We can come back to it later on in the discussion, of course, if people wish to. So one of the first things that I realised with the Milgram tapes, and again, many others of conclusion as well. Nesta's work leads us in this direction. Gina Perry's work as well, very important, is around the issue of standardisation. And I think even a fairly cursory listen to experiments tells us that they're not standardised in any straightforward sense, at least not as it would be understood within social psychology conventionally. But just to remind ourselves of the importance that Milgram himself placed on the idea of standardization as an experimental psychologist, this is a quote from his first published paper on the obedience studies. He says it was important to standardize the experimenter's responses, and then he gives us the famous prods, the 4 sequential prods, which had to be used in order and started anew from each new attempt at defiance, and then the 2 special prods, which could be used a little more flexibly as and when the situation demanded. I want to now play you an extract. This is from condition 2, so voice feedback, and just with these prods in mind, we'll be able to see fairly straightforwardly, I think, the extent to which this script was or wasn't followed. And again, it's it's one of the early experimental conditions, so Milgram was clearly still developing his procedure here. I think Nesta made that point many years ago. But nevertheless, it's presented as part of the main experiments. It should be following the procedure as published, but as we'll see, it clearly doesn't. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Either give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if it's not working, and we'll see how it goes.
I'm going to administer 120 volts. think I want to be a part of this anymore.
Please continue.
No.
It's absolutely essential that you go on.
Well, if he says it's all right with me. We'll ask him if he wants to go on.
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must continue.
Well, I wouldn't continue without asking him.
As I explained to both, to him when you were there, although these facts may be extremely painful, there was no permanent tissue damage.
Well, I still don't want to go on unless he says all right.
Okay, so I think that was a door closing there. And just while there's a period of silence, we can already see we missed out prod 2. I don't know if anybody picked up on that. We went from prod 1 straight to prod 3. We had some tailoring to the particular demands of the situation. The experimenter says, as I explained to him when you were there, which again, we see these little departures from standardization throughout, not just this session, but all of the recordings. And then we've got a participant who's stuck to his guns and asked him to go and see if he's all right, see what happens.
He seems willing enough to go on, so please continue.
Wet, night, grass, duck, cloth.
We've done that one already. Would you,
all right.
What's the next one, Fred?
Brave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. That's wrong. I'm going to administer 135 volts. Brave, woman. White, cloud, horse, rock, house. That's wrong. I'm going to administer 150 volts. White, horse.
Please continue.
Not under those conditions. Not with him hollering.
I just checked on him, and he seemed perfectly willing to continue, so please continue.
No, not unless I think he said he's hollering and that. This is,
Okay, I'll pause it there. I think we've heard enough for you to hopefully get a sense of what was going on there. I hope you were able to follow it. What we get there seemingly is the experimenter staging the kind of leaving of the room to have an apparent consultation with the learner who's in an adjoining laboratory, and comes back and said he seems willing enough to go on, so please continue, and that gets the participant, the naive participant, to go on for a couple more shocks. And then of course we get to the 150 volt point where the learner withdraws his consent and demands to be released. And even then we get the experimenter drawing on that visit, that supposed visit to the learner. I was just in there and he seemed okay to go on. So we've got that then used as a rhetorical resource to try and convince and persuade the naive participant to stay in the situation, to keep going. And needless to say, all these things, as well as those more minor departures of standardization I picked out just a moment or two ago, none of these are captured within the script for the experimental situation. And of course, anybody with a passing familiarity with the history or the sociology of science won't particularly be surprised by this, because we may be familiar with some of the work that talks about the contingency of standardization in things like structured survey interviews, or even in the natural sciences as well, the extent to which there is a kind of a divorce between the way in which scientific procedure and methodology is presented in the method section of journal articles or in textbook accounts of it, and how it actually unfolds in reality. Yet until whenever it was, a decade or so ago, and a number of us started to kind of pick these things out of the Milgram tapes, it wasn't something that had really been grasped about these the obedience experiments particularly at all. There were one or two sort of vague nods in that direction. I think John Darley back in the mid-90s had touched on it. But it was really because of the availability of the archived audio recordings that scholars were able to get in there and start to pick these things out. So what I take from this, or what I'd like us to take from it for the purpose of my argument today really, is obviously the experimental procedure is not as it was reported by Milgram. So that, I've shown you a fairly kind of radical departure from standardization. I'm not trying to make the claim that all the sessions had similarly radical departures. Some of us did, some of them didn't, but clearly there was a lot of tailoring to the specific demands of the particular interaction going on at any one time. I think what it does tell us is the importance of language and of rhetoric, of discourse. Quite often the participants, when they are disobeying, are not simply saying no, they're actually providing arguments and accounts for why they want to discontinue their participation in the experiment. And similarly, the experiment is not simply sticking to the prods and ordering them to go on. The experimenter is trying to persuade them to keep going. So there's a rhetorical dimension to the interaction. And that means the experiment is having to do a lot more than simply issue orders to keep people going. It's not simply about people following. And this is important because, as many of you will know, I'm sure, this is the conventional Milgram's experiments, that it shows as it stands as the demonstration par excellence in social science of people following orders even when that requires them potentially commit harm to another individual. So here's a quote from Art Miller from a few years ago, one of the key names in Milgram scholarship, if you like, generally somebody who's not uncritical of Milgram, but sympathetic towards Milgram's work. He says, in Milgram's script for the experimenter's role, the four increasingly strident and demanding prods have always struck me as one of the most important features of the obedience paradigm, as the most explicit operationalization of authority. The fourth prod reads as follows: "You have no other choice, you must go on." Taken literally and out of context, these words are clearly preposterous. They violate any reasonable sense of ethics. In context, of course, they appear to have had considerable persuasive force. Now, for me, the key word in this quote, as recently as 2009, is appear. They appear to have had considerable persuasive force, because at that time, nobody had actually looked at whether those words did have any persuasive force, whether they did do what we'd assumed all those years they do, which is to get people to keep going. That prod in particular tends to be seen as pretty important, not just by Art Miller, and that's primarily because it seems, according to Milgram's own definition of a command or an order, it seems to be the best candidate of those prods for meeting this definition. So Milgram himself defined a command as consisting of two main parts: a definition of action and the imperative that the action be executed. A request, for example, contains a definition of action, but lacks the insistence that it be carried out. Now, we might quibble with that definition, but under that definition, certainly something like "please continue" or "please go on" doesn't really seem to meet the requirements of that definition. So it's for this reason that Milgram scholars generally have focused on this fourth prod. Here's Steve Reicher and Alex Haslam saying that or not people obey this fourth prompt is decisive in establishing the validity of those interpretations of Milgram studies that see them as a. So if we want to retain a sense in which Milgram studies can be seen as examples of people following orders, we need to see that they're obeying, they're carrying on after having received this fourth prod. So simple question then, do they? And to address this, I looked at again, those two conditions, 2 and 20, those baseline or the best examples of the baseline conditions that we have in the archives. And actually what we find is prod 4 is really rather ineffective. There's other people who've done similar work from methodological and conceptual perspective. Also, we've got some nice sort of converging evidence, if you like, that points us in this direction. But in terms of the archival analysis, when we look at conditions 2 and 20, we find that there are 23 participants in total is used, and only on 2 of those occasions does it elicit any further shocks, and only one of those participants goes all the way to 450 volts. That was somebody who was already quite close to the end anyway. So it looks like this idea that people follow orders in Milgram's experiments, if it hinges on people obeying that 4th prod, it looks like we've already got one major problem with this line of argument here. And let's have a look at how people actually resisted it. If as people like Art Miller said, this is, you know, it appears to have had such considerable persuasive force, you would think it would therefore be incredibly difficult for people to resist this the force of this particular. But actually, again, when we look at it, it's very easy. They do it quite easily. Here's one example from 20. You have no other choice. You must continue. I won't continue. Then we'll have to. And this was the most common way when we looked at the data. This is the most common way, really, in which people do it. Straightforward, almost like sort of, you say one thing, I'll say the other. Rhetorical negation, if you like. You have no choice. I have a choice. You must continue. I won't continue. We also get people using questions as well, which then got the experimenter to retract. So here we have another one from condition 20. You have no choice, really. Again, a markedly weaker form of that. Why? You mean I can't get up and leave? Certainly. But I mean, if you don't go on, we'll have to discontinue. So anybody who questioned the experimenter at this point got a very swift withdrawal of that. You have no choice. What, you mean I can't get up and leave? Oh, yes, you can. Okay, I do have a choice then. And then people typically were able to bring things to an end. So what we've seen so far is the experimenter is frequently doing a lot more than simply issuing orders. He's controlling, persuading, and dissembling as well. And when he did issue orders, or what we have as the best example of an order in the Milgram paradigm, they weren't very effective. So I would argue that for a long, long time now, for over 50 years, nearly 60 years now, isn't it? We've seen these experiments as demonstrations of people following orders. There is, I think now it's fair to say, growing consensus that Milgram's obedience experiments do not show people obeying orders. They actually show the opposite. They show people disobeying orders. That's not to say people aren't going to the end of the shot machine. They are, yeah. But there's you know, whatever we might think about Milgram, he didn't make all that stuff up. They definitely went to the end of the shot machine, but they didn't do it because they were following orders. They were disobeying the orders. This then leads us to the question of obedience, because in social psychology, we're really stuck on this definition of obedience, as we have here from Cassin et al.'s widely used textbook, Behavior Change Produced by the Commands of Authority, or from Jerry Berger in a handbook chapter. Obedience researchers are interested in how individuals respond to orders or demands from a person or institution in a position of authority. So there's a little bit of leeway in these definitions, but they all seem to involve a particular social act, command, the order. It's there in pretty much every definition I've been able to find within social psychology. So does that mean, therefore, that we say that Milgram's experiments are no longer demonstrations of obedience? Well, I'm going to suggest that actually it's not so much that the experiments don't show us obedience. I'm going to suggest that it's the definition that we use in social psychology that is wrong and needs reconceptualizing. And to do this, I'll just use one example, just a case study, if you like, from condition 4, the touch proximity condition. If you recall, We've got 30% obedience here. I selected this here when I came to this particular bit of the analysis because I thought, well, almost, we need to find situations where it should be really easy to disobey. So we need to find a condition with really low obedience levels in order to see what's going on there. And again, hopefully it'll become clear why as I go along. So we've got, it's still relatively high given what they're expected to do. They've got to grab the guy's hand and sort of physically force it down on the shock plate, as you can see in the famous picture here. But nevertheless, it's one of the lower obedience rates in Milgram's experiments. So I'm going to try play you another clip here. I've put the transcript, the volume level on the condition 4 tapes is just generally a bit lower than for some of the others. So apologies if you're struggling to actually follow the audio here. Hopefully you can follow on the transcripts or sort of a combination of the two. But I'll try and pick as we go. The key thing to say here, we're getting to the point in this particular experiment where the learner is about to withdraw his consent, demand to be released. And you've got to remember as well that the learner now isn't in a different room in the laboratory. He's sat there acting his socks off, trying to kind of give the impression to the naive participant of somebody who's really in anguish here, not liking these shocks, wanting to get out. So again, I won't go into the details of standardization here, but it's even harder to standardize these experiments because you've got somebody doing the acting live, whereas previously it was the learner's responses were at least pre-recorded on tape. So what we're going to hear is the learner withdrawing his consent and then the experimenter explaining to the naive participant that in order to carry on, he's going to have to hold this guy's hand down on the shock plate.
Wrong. 150 volts.
Oh!
White horse.
Experimenter, I don't want to go along with this anymore. I refuse to go on anymore. I don't want the shocks.
Relax and try and concentrate on what the teacher is saying.
I'm not going to touch that plate anymore. I don't want these shocks
Teacher,
anymore.
please continue.
Sad, face, music, clown, girl. Correct. Short, sentence, movie, skirt, time. Wrong. 165 volts. Put the plate.
Learner, you must depress the plate.
I'm not touching that plate anymore. I don't want these shocks anymore.
You must depress the plate in order to receive the punishment.
I'm not part of this experiment anymore. I don't want any more shocks. I'm not touching the plate.
Teacher, you'll just have to reach over and push his hand down onto the plate.
I don't want any
And
more.
then administer the punishment when you have his hand down onto the plate. Please continue, teacher.
Do the same one over.
Yes, administer the punishment for a short time.
No, I don't want any more. I don't want any more shocks. Now I'll push my hand down. I don't want any more. Oh!
Okay, so we hear here a fairly typical exchange that happens at this point in this particular condition. But what I want you to take from this really is simply that the teacher here, the naive participant, is not really saying much, is going along with the experimenter's instructions, following the procedure, being obedient, if you want to use that term. Whether at this stage we would say he's following orders is open to question, not according to Milgram's own definition, because there really hasn't needed to be much in the way of any orders administered because there's been no resistance. There's a lot of to and fro between the experimenter and the learner, but of course they're both stooges. They're part of the setup, so of course they're kind of staging this conflict. So what we see ultimately, and let's just take one of the turns here. A teacher, you'll just have to reach over and push his hand down onto the plate. Well, according to Milgram's definition, I think it would be a struggle to say that this order. So do we describe this as something else? Following instructions, simply doing as one is told in very sort of loose and informal terms. All of those could still count as obedience, though, I would argue, regardless of whether we want to describe this particular talk here as an order or a request or something else. And again, just from the same participant, but much further on into the experimental session now, 450 volts. So this is a participant, and remember I said I'm trying to find people here who are in a condition where it should be one of the easier ones to resist and defy the experimenter, but these are people who are still obedient. How are they doing it? Surely there's some sort of great struggle and battle rules going on, but again, there isn't. This guy has gone through, quite passively through the experiment, administering the test, administering the shocks as punishment. And here we get towards the end of the procedure.
450 volt.
Ow!
That's it. We want to start from the beginning.
No, continue using the last switch on the board, please.
Brave woman. White cloud horse rock house. 450 volt.
Get away!
Press it down in that time.
I don't want any shocks. I don't want any
Make
nerve.
sure you hear the buzz on that shock, please.
I don't want it. I don't want any more shocks. I want out.
You hear the buzz.
Oh!
Sad face music clown girl. 450 volt.
Oh!
Short sentence.
All right, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
So again, we could just pick out a couple of the experimenters' turns here. Continue using the last switch on the board, please. Administer the punishment again, so you can hear the buzz. Again, I think we'd be hard pushed to say that these meet Milgram's own definition of what constitutes an order or a command. So we're seeing here quite late in the experimental session a participant who's relatively passively going along with the experimental procedure. There's not much attempt at resistance there, and as a result, the experimenter isn't having to issue many of the prods at all, and not much more than a please continue needed here, and some sort of technical instructions. So this then leads to the question of, well, whether the obedient participants need the prods. We've looked at whether when people get prod 4, do they carry on or not, and we've seen that they don't. But actually, what about all those obedient participants? And it turns out that hardly any participants who are obedient need to have many of the prods. So again, we go back to conditions 2 and 20, the classic sort of baseline conditions. There are in total in the archives 44 obedient participants that we can access there. For 37 of those, they needed no more than a please continue or please go on. 5 of them required the second prod, and then just a couple, prod 3 and prod 4. So the overwhelming majority of participants who go all the way to the end of the shock scale in Milgram's procedure don't actually need, don't even need prod 2, never mind prod 4, which we're told is the best example for an actual order in the experiments. But even if you don't buy that and you think, well, surely prod 2 and prod 3 might be orders as well, we're still seeing that most of the obedient participants don't need those prods either. And there's the book, which Raphael very kindly plugged for me earlier on. So a resounding no. Do obedient participants need the prod? No, they don't. So again, it's this idea that for nearly 60 years now, we've just got the wrong end of the stick with Milgram. As we've already seen, when people receive orders in Milgram's experiment, they disobey them. And people who go all the way in Milgram's experiment don't need orders. So there's something else going on. The question I want to return to is, well, is this therefore not obedience? What do you mean by obedience in any context? And particularly as a social psychologist myself, my concern is that our social psychological conceptualization and analysis is appropriate. And I just think at the moment that it isn't, because these definitions that we've had for many decades that rely on this particular social act. And I tend to think of something as mundane as driving and trying to keep the needle at 30 or whatever the limit is, and obeying the law. We use the phrase obedience or obeying the law in everyday context where we actually don't use it to mean anything to do with overt orders or commands from authority. It's more subtle than that. It's to do with the way in which these particular prescriptions become embedded into the fabric of everyday life, social norms, if you will. We just know that we've got to keep that needle at 30 or whatever. The other examples are many and varied. So I think even analysis of how we use the language in everyday talk suggests that there's something more subtle there, and that we don't necessarily need this kind of authority figure there giving us the orders and the commands, as social psychology seems to suggest that we do. So I simply want to propose a revised definition of obedience, which removes this idea of the order or the talking, as far as I should be talking about, submission to the requirements of an authority. But importantly, those requirements don't need to be stated. And I think this is important for social psychology, if you like, to move beyond the legacy of the Milgram experiments, because I think part of the problem is we've kind of saddled ourselves with Milgram's experiments, intellectually pickings, and who am I to object? I'm making a lot of those experiments myself, so I do appreciate the irony of it. But nevertheless, in terms of our understanding and conceptualization of obedience, I think it has had a negative impact on social psychology, because we have stuck almost too rigidly, in my view, to that definition of obedience, which I don't think is fit for purpose. And if we remove this idea that we need the overt order or the command, we actually can start to think about obedience in a much wider range of social settings. It can help us to explain, I think, the Milgram and other situations where there appears to be quite obvious sort of obedient relationships in terms of commands or orders, military settings, professional settings, educational settings. But it can also start to get us into a different kind of analysis of those more diffuse authority relationships, such as obeying the law, or even any kind of social norm, queuing at an airport here, or maybe even obeying regulations around social distancing, or whatever it may be. We can start to think of these in terms of obedience in a very different sense to how we've understood it in psychology previously. And again, I think it touches on one of the bits of the discussion I picked up on before. We start to think about obedience in terms of some element of conformity there as well, and the two concepts start to bleed into each other. But I do think this is an important starting point for social psychology to start to move onwards and move beyond the double-edged sword, if you like, of Milgram's legacy. It provides such rich intellectual pickings, as I've said, but I think it really has hamstrung how, as a discipline, we've tried to make sense of obedience and wider processes of authority over the years. And there I shall leave it. Thank you for your attention. And of course, happy to take any questions, comments, observations. Thank you.
Many thanks, Stephen. We'll give you a round of applause, virtual.
Thank you.
I don't know how to do that. Yeah, here. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much. And I had also thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Also, thank you for sharing these recordings, because this is really amazing to hear that. So I had a question regarding your position in the literature, in the current literature on Milgram. Since I think one of more prominent interpretation now of the experiment is Haslam and Reicher's experiment, Reicher engaged followership model, and they say that we should not speak about obedience, we should speak about followership. So, and I have the impression that you say, okay, this is not correct because you just gave too much credit to Berger's view that if the force prod is not an order, then the experiment is not about orders. And in your paper, you actually say that even when the experimenter says, please continue, it's already an order. So it counts as an order in the context. So even we put aside the question of order. So actually your idea is that you contradict Aslam and Reicher's theory, and you say no, it's about obedience. It's people just it's not about the obedience as we usually think about it, but it's still about obedience, and it explains. It's a thesis to explain the behavior of people.
Yeah, I mean I think there's not. It's not necessarily the case that it's completely incompatible with the idea of engaged followership. I think the idea of engaged followership with the participants identifying with the scientist figure there. I'm sure there's something to that for some of the participants some of the time. I think part of the issue for me is looking at it in that sort of micro level of detail and working out how those, if you like, those processes of identification sort of wax and wane over the course of the experimental session, how the sort of alliances are kind of worked up from moment to moment. At certain points, the naive participant is forming an alliance with the learner, and then it kind of fades away, and they seem to be kind of more allied to the experimenter. I think we can track those processes as well rhetorically. I think I'm not necessarily, I guess this is where I would maybe kind of say, please continue grammatically isn't an order, okay? Yeah. In the context in which it's uttered, as you said, perhaps it takes on the character of an order, but really, in one sense, it's not actually the words that are doing that. It's to do with the wider institutional setup, the wider situation. And so what I've most recently tried to kind of make sense of is how Milgram set up that situation. And Nestor's done some good work on this as well, but I've tried to almost use rhetoric and argumentation as a metaphor here to see how argumentation is woven into the design of the experiment itself. So even you think about the shock generator, and many people over the years have identified the importance of the way in which those shock levers go up in 15-volt increments, okay? In one sense, the design of the shock generator is an argument that doesn't need to be made explicit, okay? So nobody needs to say, oh, well, it's just another 15 volts, it's just another shock, because it's there. It's woven into the material fabric of the situation. It's part of the, if you want to think of it in these terms, the genius of Milgram as an experimentalist, the way in which he set up that experiment. And then I return to Michael Billig's work on rhetoric, because you might start to say, well, hang on a minute, Stephen, you've given us a perspective which talks about argumentation and rhetoric, and here we've got the absence of argumentation. We've got people who are going along to the end without arguing. They don't need to be persuaded. But what's important, and Billig gives us this in some of his later work as well, is arguments that don't need to be made, things that can be taken for granted, or things that are woven into, built into the design or the structure of a particular situation. And I think Milgram's experiments are a really nice example of that. And we do see that. And again, Nestor's work is brilliant at showing us how Milgram really took his time and went through a sort of process of trial and error to develop his experimental procedure to a point where it was going to give him what he wanted to try and kind of really, quote unquote, shock his readers.
Thank you. Chris, Phil, you have a question?
Yes, thanks very much. And
I was glad to hear a paper because I've always been troubled by the title of Milgram's book, the obedience experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And in Ordinary Men, I in fact used the term deference to authority because I didn't like the notion of obedience. And I thought deference really captured what was going on, because Trapp doesn't give a command. Trapp says, we have orders from above the highest authority. And then he rationalizes with the men. If it makes it easier, here are the reasons why it's okay to do what I'm telling you to do. The Jews support the partisans. Bombs are falling on women and children in Germany. They're killing our kids. We can kill their kids. So it's a negotiated deference. It's not a order, follow it because you have no choice. He's given them choice, and then he's persuading them. I guess I'd ask your reaction to, is deference to authority a term that captures what I was trying to do, and what I think you're kind of saying here, that builds on this bleeding from legitimacy to conformity to obligation. It seems part of what the Milgram experiment is, these people have contracted. And one of the things is they don't want to back out of the contract they've made with the experimenter. And so obligation is in there. And I don't think that, just as somebody who's taken his oath and put on a uniform and is in the reserve police, they've taken on obligations. And it's really hard to shirk an obligation that you've accepted. And it seems to me, where do we fit obligation into this whole framework? And it seems to me that's a very important component of deference to authority, both in the experiment and in reality.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think deference is a really nice way of capturing it. We could get into the question of whether deference is a subcategory of obedience, or whether it's useful to make a kind of hard and fast conceptual distinction, I guess. Something you said there actually just reminded me that Milgram's experiment does a similar thing in terms of occasionally referring to a higher authority himself. So one of his, he doesn't use it that often. I can't remember exactly how many times in the sessions I've looked at, but he does on occasion said, well, look, I have my orders, or, I've been told, by my superiors that this is how things are to happen. So he does at times position himself not as the authority, but as a functionary in the chain of command there. But on the issue of obligation, I think, again, it's important. And Milgram, as you may know, did a condition where people did sign a more limited contract, as it were, and it did, I forget the details off the top of my head, but it did reduce, I think I'm right in saying, obedience to a lower level, not drastically, I think I'm right in saying, but I think, again, that is part of the story. But I do like this idea of deference being a nice way of capturing it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Phil, you have a question?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, on a similar thing, thanks. I mean, it was really, really interesting. And I think, so two things. I mean, one is this discussion that Chris Browning came in on as well, and that you raised in the paper, what's the phenomenon we're talking about here? And I think that the key is it can't be the analyst phenomenon, right? Because all we're doing then is we're applying our interests as the analyst, and it's what was the phenomenon for the members, for the participants. And it seemed to me, I was just thinking, actually, there's a contractual relationship here because they were paid, because of the way it was set up and the way they were recruited. There will have been some, and you said that yourself just in your last response, that you said, the contract, and that of course throws up another sense of obligation, a kind of a contractual obligation, that these people have entered into a contract with the experimenters, and they feel like they need to fulfill that contract. Then that puts a different spin on how we read those interactions. Because they're the interactions between, two people that have entered into a contract together. So again, it moves it away from this idea that there's orders being delivered, which you very clearly showed doesn't take place. Even if we call them orders, then they're not taking place. And the way we would want to think of it as obedience in a way that transfers to other contexts is also very restricted. And then, and then again, I want to pull out and say, as well as looking at this and finding these problems, which you do really, really well, which draw into question what kind of obedience is taking place here. How do we characterize it? How do the members, see it? Then there's the, you step out and you say, well, there was a contract here, and these people were on, an Ivy League campus in 1960s USA. What did they, what would you in that context really think that was going on? So we all know about the replication crisis, but anyway, so that was just a comment, but yeah, I liked it a lot. Thanks.
Yeah, cheers. And I'm glad you mentioned the distinction between the analysts and the members categories as well. And it's one of the things that I'm again aware of the potential problem there in offering, as I do, my own replacement definition of obedience. As somebody sort of steeped in the sort of discursive psychological tradition of studiously avoiding analyst definitions, although I try to justify that by saying, well, in order to speak to the mainstream of social psychology, this is one of the things that one should do, because I think ultimately, otherwise this will continue to be reproduced, this unsatisfactory account. And if you can kind of open a sort of a little crack in the door, as it were, and say, look, take this out of your definition, think about it in this way, and gradually, perhaps, the door opens a little more fully for a much wider reconsideration, actually not only of Milgram studies, but of experimental practice more broadly, because I think one of the other directions to develop this, which I won't go into detail on now, but is actually, well, if the nature and meaning of the obedience experiments potentially changes as much as it does by listening to what actually happened in those laboratories, what else changes about social psychology or psychology more broadly when we actually listen to how experiments get done in practice? I think that's a really interesting question that awaits a fuller exploration.
Thank you. So there are two more questions. And we don't want to be too late. So maybe, if they could be quick, it would be good. But if you need more time, it's okay. Marlene, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm a philosopher, so maybe my question will be a little. Well, it's external to the recent debates in social psychology. And I was wondering, my question is about the definition of obedience you propose at the end, saying that it should be understood as submission to the requirement of an authority. And I'm just wondering if the received definition was like too narrow, but is it now too broad now? Yeah. Meaning, of course, the requirement of an authority can be quite implicit. And precisely, I'm thinking of a precise example, which is what we say about a woman being submitted to the masculine domination. So you would say there is a phenomena of woman submission. You would not really say woman obey. I mean, the two concepts do not seem to work, in the same way here. So, that's, I'm quite pleased with that larger definition, broader definition. So I think from a philosophical point of view, it's indeed, interesting. But in the same way, it doesn't look like there are interchangeable concepts like submission to and obedience to. Okay, so. And thank you for the recordings. It was a great moments to hear that.
I'm glad it worked. It doesn't always work from a technical point of view, and Zoom makes me a bit more nervous than Teams. I'm more used to Teams on a daily basis, but it sounds like it worked well. But yeah, thank you for the question. I think I think that's a really good point, and it may well be that that Christopher's idea of deference actually does a better job of capturing the sort of thing you're talking about there. You might not say that people that a woman would obey in that context, but maybe defer to, or maybe submit to. I think again, you know, I'm not trying to have the final word on it. You may well be right. It may be that there is more conceptual work to do, and the sort of opening out conceptually then is followed by a kind of a fine tuning of it. I think the other thing to say as well, you know, I am you know, very conscious that I'm you know, talking about a social psychological definition in an audience with lots of interdisciplinary social scientists, philosophers, and historians. And you're all too kind to say, well, you know, why should we wait for social psychology to catch up? Because actually, when you're looking you know, in social theory, you know, we had a comment about Foucault before. Foucault's writing on you know, discipline and punish, whether you're a fan of Foucault or not. You know, there's a whole a rich array of conceptual resources there. You know, in some respects, this isn't new to some areas of social science, which makes it all the more frustrating. Again, there's often that kind of distinction or chasm, if you like, with social psychology being somewhat to one side of the wider social sciences, and hasn't kind of followed some of the conceptual moves in the wider social sciences that have taken place. And I think the turn to language in the 80s and 90s is a good example of that. It really didn't take hold in psychology in the same way that it did in some other fields. But yeah, I think you're quite right that yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to say that all examples of submission necessarily need to be conceptualized as obedience. So yeah, maybe there's some further fine tuning to be done there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Nesta, I don't know if you want to raise your question or just save it for your presentation.
Oh, I was just interested in condition 4 in terms of standardization. I've always wondered at the 345 volt switch in all the other experiments, the learner is rendered at least unconscious. So in condition 4, obviously that didn't happen. So this is another example of the lack of standardization in the experiments. I've always seen the experiments not necessarily, I haven't looked for a better definition of obedience because I don't think the experiments are about obedience, and I've written about that. But I think they're about the resolution of a moral dilemma. That's the way I see it. And Milgram designed the experiment with all kinds of techniques of social engineering, including a contract, including foot in the door phenomenon, including all kinds of manipulative techniques. And cumulatively, they encourage people to resolve the moral dilemma in favor of completing the experiment for many subjects. That's how I've seen it. So I was just wondering about condition 4 anyway, about why didn't the victim go unconscious at 3:45?
Well, very briefly on that, what's interesting is that the supposed rendering unconscious of the victim actually only came in condition 5. So in condition 2, which is the other one in that early proximity series that I've looked at, he doesn't go unconscious in that either. He just carries on screaming for a lot longer. So yeah, my initial feeling when I first listened to that was I'm going to hear somebody pretending to be sort of lying prone on the ground, pretending to be unconscious. But actually, in one sense, methodologically, that isn't an issue because Milgram hadn't introduced that particular part of the script at that stage.
Yeah, but he did include it in his book, and he included that photo, which suggested that it was part of the experiment when it wasn't. They were more pilot studies. The proximity series, the first 4 experiments are really pilot studies.
Yeah, I think the book is very carefully, when you get into the details of how he words the procedure in the book, it's a kind of study in ambiguity, really, because there's a lot of things when you know what's happened in the experimental conditions. Actually, technically he wasn't telling fibs, porky pies, if you'll forgive the colloquialism. It kind of, it doesn't fall to pieces necessarily, but it's definitely ambiguous.
Thank you. There is a brief comment by Stephen Lux.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I just find this enormously interesting. I just want to say about a kind of conceptual point that it's really about authority. I mean, I very much like what Christopher Browning says about deference to authority. And obedience is only one way you can defer to authority. And I just want to mention, and this is the brief comment, I mean, I think authority is the key here. And I think the best analysis I know of what authority is comes from Joseph Raz, who says, authority is where you don't apply your own reason, your own judgment. You abdicate judging from your own point of view about whatever it is you're required to do or think, because you think there's a good reason why someone else has the authority to require you to do whatever it is. And so that suggests to me there are lots of different ways in which we can be induced to not think about the reasons for whatever it is, not to abdicate our judgment. One is contract, but there are other ways in which we can abdicate or not apply our own thinking or judgment. For example, when our self-confidence is undermined, or where we have such trust in those who we think of as having authority that we abdicate for those reasons. So that seems to me to be what's opened up by, I think, Christopher Browning's very useful way of thinking about this in terms of deference to authority. That's all. That's my brief comment.